Welcome to BICOM's weekly podcast. My name is James Sorene, and this week we are focusing entirely on UK and China in the Middle East. That is because we are publishing a paper this week that explores that very topic, and I'm delighted to kick off the podcast with Sam Nurding, who is our research associate here at BICOM and who has been beavering away on this paper for some time. Welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Thank you for having me.
It's a fascinating overview, I think, of a subject that doesn't always get as much attention as perhaps it deserves. I think we look at China and its role in a number of issues around the world, but in the Middle East, not perhaps as much as we should. What really surprised you when you first started researching this?
Thank you, James. I think there are actually a couple of things that surprised me when I was researching. One of them is just actually the sheer scale of Chinese trade and investment in the region. You'll recall when we actually spoke about kind of thinking about China, we said that there's this elephant in the room, that everyone's talking about this emerging China in the region. Well, actually, China's there already today in the region. If you look at trade, it actually outweighs US and UK together in terms of its bilateral trade in the region, which is just quite incredible. So I think the first thing...
But by some measure, significantly larger than the US.
I think it's double the US, triple what the UK does. So when we're going to events, we're hearing people say, yes, there's this elephant in the room, there's this kind of emerging tiger. Actually, China's there, and it's already got a massive influence in terms of its economic leverage with the countries in the region. So when people go through and hopefully they'll read the report, I think that's the one thing that will kind of jump out at them is actually the sheer scale of Chinese investment, and it's actually happening today already. And I think countries like the UK, maybe the US also, probably should be starting to think about how this is going to affect the policies, not only going forward, but today, this year, next year, going ahead. That was one of the things. Another thing which I think was surprising, actually to both of us, and I think you mentioned this in your op-ed, but it's definitely worth emphasising, is how important China is to Iran. Not in terms of military trade, but weapons, but also in terms of trade and key investment projects. So one of the stats which just completely blew me out of the way was in 2000, Sino-Iranian bilateral trade was 2.4 billion. That actually jumped to 37 billion just in the space of 15 years. So we're thinking about kind of Iran today under the kind of the pressure of the US maximum pressure campaign, trying to stay ahead of the water. The Chinese life jacket is really keeping it ahead of the water. So I think how important China is to Iran was something which really surprised me.
And also in the paper, what emerges is that not only is there this vast kind of array of Chinese infrastructure projects across the region, but it's also quite a major arms supplier, isn't it? And that's also something that not everyone realises.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of, if you we spoke to some military experts about this as well. Historically, China has kind of had their foot in the water a bit in terms of like missiles, but to Iran especially, and now apparently to Saudi Arabia. But yeah, it's kind of and to Egypt historically, whereas now it's really expanding its repertoire and its shopping list to the Middle East. It can give quite good. Its weapon caliber isn't as good as the US, but it can really undercut them in terms of its value. So it's really kind of expanding, particularly to the Gulf and to the event countries. It's becoming like a bigger supplier. It's still behind the US and UK, I think, in terms of its qualitative kind of power. But it's definitely something which UK should be looking out for in terms of its military sales and its kind of advanced or kind of competition in the future. There's also one other thing which I think is definitely worth emphasising, is that when we're speaking to some experts, it was kind of interesting to find out that there is no one department driving the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative in China. What was interesting is that since kind of President Xi announced the policy in 2013, it's actually been like a kind of competition between different departments to try and get the money to actually invest in certain parts of the world. And that makes it very hard to actually understand what actually is a Belt and Road Initiative project. So that was just, again, for me, something really interesting. You have kind of a potentially 1 to 8 trillion policy, and there is no one actual department driving it. So it was also very hard to try and understand kind of where this can go in the future. But I think if you're looking at, in terms of the UK, US, in terms of the UK, so in terms of US and China relations and its trade war, then I suspect China will become a lot more selective in what it's going to do in the future in terms of its investments.
Right. Well, Sam, I want to thank you very much for all your work on this project, and I hope our listeners will have a look at the paper online, and I really recommend that. It's a really serious piece of work that I think will create a lot of discussion about what Chinese interests are in the Middle East, what they're trying to achieve, and also what the UK and indeed the US need to do to try and address that. But thank you, Sam, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I am delighted to be joined by Dr Andreas Krieg, who is Assistant Professor of Security Studies at King's College London. Welcome, Andreas, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the things I wanted to just ask about first is if you could just give us sort of an outline of what you think, sort of, what is China's strategy in the Middle East? Is it to sort of, be friends with everyone, do as much trade as possible, invest in as much infrastructure as possible, as like a sort of extension of its general global strategy, or is there something much more specific happening in the Middle East?
Yes, I mean, for the most part, it is about expanding their empire and their reach in terms of trade. So the main objective is economics and trade. So geopolitics is seen as a vehicle to basically build these kind of ties that they need. And specifically, why I think the Middle East might be more important than, let's say, South America or even the west coast of Africa, is because it is an integral part of the One Road, One Belt initiative. So having good relationships with partners, or building these sustainable relationships with partners in the Middle East, without a certain conditionality that we might have in the West when it comes to human rights and democracy, really building relationships that are based on mutual interests, is something that is all a part of the initiative of building a direct trade connection between China and the West, particularly Europe. And obviously the Middle East is kind of the integral part and point of this kind of effort.
And one of the most interesting things, I think, about China's role, and there's something that we outline in our paper, is that it appears that China is able to really straddle these very deep conflicts in the region. And if we take some examples, like, it's able to have big trade relations, arms sales with countries in the Gulf. It's also able to be a very big player in Iran. And it's also able to have extensive trade relations and infrastructure investments in Israel. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, for them, money doesn't smell. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, whether it is, the Iranians or the Arab Gulf states or, Israel for that matter, or Turkey. It doesn't matter. For them, they don't look at the world, and definitely not at the Middle East, as a multipolar environment where they have to cater to one pole but cannot cater to the other. It's not a zero-sum game. I think they see it as mutually beneficial and a win-win situation for everyone. And that's the interesting part also for the partners they deal with in the Middle East. So whether it's the Israelis or the Arab Gulf states or the Iranians, they all see a benefit of reaching out and dealing with China because they see them as the potential competitor for the United States and the West moving forward. So anyone who thinks strategically long-term over the next 20, 30 years will see that China will probably and is already outperforming the West in terms of investments, but could potentially also outperform the West when it comes to giving security assurances and more of a geopolitical umbrella for the region.
So if I could just zoom in on your particular area of expertise, which is around the Gulf. I mean, could you give us some examples of just how important and how extensive those relations are between China and the Gulf?
Now, in the Gulf, the most important relationship that China has is definitely with the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. The UAE see themselves, and their grand strategy is about building sustainable relationships outside of the Gulf with partners across the world. They usually always focused on the United States, as all other Arab Gulf states do. They see the West as, especially the United States, as the kind of protector. This is where most of the investments are coming from. This is where they are investing. This is where they are looking towards. But over the last couple of years, particularly post Obama and the perception in the Gulf that America is disengaging from the region, they have had their own little pivot towards Asia, the Arab Gulf states. And the UAE in particular have reached out to China very early on. But so have Saudi Arabia and Qatar as the big three players in the Gulf. But why the United Arab Emirates is so important here is because the United Arab Emirates have a long standing strategy of trying to become the key anchor point for any trade relations in that region. So that's the reason why the United Arab Emirates are expanding beyond the Gulf into building ports around the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, Somalia, in Sudan, in order to kind of be the most important player in that part of the world, and they are actually. So Dubai Ports World is one of the biggest operator of port terminals in the world. Jebel Ali is the key port in the UAE, and it's operated by Dubai Ports World. But the problem with Jebel Ali is it is inside the Gulf, on the western side of the Strait of Hormuz. So it doesn't have a direct access to the Indian Ocean, and obviously is thereby somewhat vulnerable to any operations that the Iranians might do, as we have seen over the last couple of months. So for the UAE, they have therefore are investing in Aden, which is southern Yemen, in northern Somalia, in Sudan. They were in Djibouti for a long period of time, were kicked out eventually. But what is unfolding here is a little war over ports in this part of the world. And people would say, what's the role of China in that? So for the Chinese to build their One Road, One Belt initiative, and as I said before, the entire maritime trade will go through the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is between Yemen and Somalia, and potentially also through the Gulf. And if the key player here is the UAE, because they are the key provider of port facilities in this part of the world, then the Chinese inevitably have to either compete with the Emiratis or enter into a partnership. And I think the latter one is probably the more likely solution, because what the Emiratis are trying to do is they're trying to offer the Chinese the opportunity of saying, if you want to trade past or through this part of the world, you will have to deal with us, and that obviously creates a lot of leverage for the UAE as a small state in the region, but also is a partnership whereby both countries also ideologically are looking eye to eye. So the difference here is that while the West always enters the Gulf with a certain tit for tat or some conditionality on the support that we provide based on human rights developments, we want to see democratization. We usually criticize when things go wrong. During the Yemen war now, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia post Khashoggi affair, we in the West, we always tend to say to the Gulf states, if you don't follow through, we will not sell you any arms, and there have been arms embargoes for periods of times. The Chinese don't have that conditionality. They don't care. For them, it's about interest. They see mutual interest and they advance them. They themselves obviously are not a liberal democracy. Much of what they do, what we consider to be problematic in terms of how they deal with civil liberties and so on, is something that the Emiratis are emulating. They're actually importing that kind of technology from China. They would not be getting that technology from us for the most part. So in order to build the kind of state that the Emiratis want to build, or that the Saudis want to build, and to an extent the Qataris want to build, they can go to the Chinese, and the Chinese are selling it to them. So and I think that's part of that relationship.
And beyond the ports, I mean, how significant are some of these big Chinese infrastructure investments in some of the Gulf states? I mean, how significant are they going to be for that modernization drive?
So in Oman, for example, it is very important. So the Omanis are struggling economically, and they have done so since the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring, we've seen a bit of uprisings in Oman because people are not doing very well. The economy is not doing very well. And now the Qataris are investing in Oman at the moment as well, but never on the same level that the Chinese can. The Chinese can spend billions and billions of dollars. That does not necessarily trickle down to the people, but these are infrastructure projects which, at least that's what the Omanis think, in the long term will generate, employment for people in the area. And potentially create a competing port to Jebel Ali on the western side of the Strait of Hormuz. So Oman is on the eastern side of the Strait of Hormuz, i.e. have direct access to the Indian Ocean, and therefore any port there is probably more important to the Chinese than Jebel Ali. So there is a bit of competition here between the UAE and Oman over who gets most of the investments, and obviously the Emiratis are not attracting that kind of Chinese investment at the moment because they want a more of an on-par partnership, while the Omanis are clearly in an inferior position. As we have seen, if you look at what the Chinese are doing with the One Road, One Belt initiative, most of the time the countries they work with are, in an inferior situation where where the Chinese impose themselves on these countries and saying, we're going to invest here. They bring their own Chinese companies, their own Chinese workers, and very little really trickles down to the people. But there is obviously a lot of allegations about corruption, whereby local elites in these countries have benefited more than actually the people from these kind of infrastructure projects. Something similar is happening potentially also in Oman. But for the Omanis long term, if they want to become the key, a strategic partner in the Gulf, that is something that for the Omani economy would be very important. And for the Chinese, it's important because they obviously need a way for resupplying themselves, potentially also for their navy. So what we see when we talk about ports now, we talk about trade. But obviously long term, I think the Chinese do have also the ambition to expand their navy from a green water to a blue water navy that actually could project power all the way into the Mediterranean. And in order to do that, they need to have certain ports along the way that they can dock in and can rely on. And these kind of port facilities that they're building are now commercial, but with the exception of Djibouti, where there is already a military component, I think most of these ports that the Chinese are building will have eventually a military component in there as well. And that is something where, long term, most of the Westerners are looking with a lot of suspicion, are saying, actually they are competing with us in a way that we cannot compete. So Britain, France, Germany, the European countries have no way of competing in terms of capacity with what the Chinese can actually bring to the table. And that's probably something where we're quite concerned.
Yeah, I mean, there's something as well we mentioned in our paper around potential conflicts there with UK interests, where, for instance, you might have a UK military base, and then they find that actually the base is in a sort of area that's now a kind of Chinese owned and run port, and that presents issues for logistics and communications, all sorts of other issues that may become problematic in the future. I mean, how significant do you think that could be?
I do think at this point the Chinese, we in the West, we try to paint that picture and securitize China, and saying the Chinese have, what are their ambitions, because they're kind of ambiguous of where they're going and how they're going about it. If we look at the objectives, I don't think that, the Chinese at this point are in a zero-sum race, whereby it's us versus you, I think it's more of a win-win. So the Chinese, they have no problem having a British military facility next to a Chinese military facility in the Gulf. Where we are concerned of in the West, what we're concerned about is the ways and means that the Chinese might be using in order to achieve their objectives, and we don't trust them to actually go about it in the future once they have the leverage in a way which would be mutually beneficial. But for the time being, I don't think there is going to be a problem, not from a Chinese point of view. From a British point of view, the same thing applies. And there is a bit of caveat here. So yes, the Chinese have the capacity, they have the economic depth and the strategic depth and patience that we in the West do not have. So they have a clear competitive advantage long term. But in the short and medium term, there is no way that the Chinese can match the hard and soft power projection that the West has in this part of the world. And we shouldn't forget that across the MENA region, not just the Gulf, the legacy of Britain, even as a colonial power, as negative connotated as it might be, is still something that Britain can rely on. And I think there are certain sustainable long-term relationships that exist across the region that locals also buy in, and Britain still is very interested in maintaining. And that is something the Chinese don't have. The Chinese don't have that kind of reach, and they don't have that legacy. If you also look at where do Arab Gulfies go when they go and study or when they want to buy an apartment, they don't travel to China. They don't go and study in China. They come and study in London, or they go to New York or Washington. And that is not going to change. So that soft power appeal I think Britain has in particular is not going to change. When it comes to hard power, and we're looking at the military, again here, I think the key is ability and willingness to use that capacity and capability to project power. And I think the fact that we have, as Britain, have a Royal Navy component in Bahrain is still something that the Chinese don't have in the region. But if they wanted to, if they had a willingness of doing it, they could basically turn it around quite quickly, and there's nothing we can do about it because we're already on our last limb when it comes to that kind of power projection in this part of the world. Britain does a lot in Oman as well. There are components in Qatar and the UAE as well, but it's small. So if the Chinese wanted to build this up, they could do it very quickly, and there's nothing we could do about it. There is something to be said about the Americans. The Americans still, the most important military base in that part of the world is in Qatar, and it's going to stay there. There's new arrangements that have been made, so the Americans are there to stay. But how willing are the Americans to actually defend interests that are not entirely vital for them, but vital for their partners? And we've seen that recently with the attacks on Saudi Arabia, where the propensity of the Americans to actually step up the game and respond to what is very likely an Iranian escalation was very low. So the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris are saying, how much can we actually rely on the Americans? Yes, we have them here, but are they actually providing security to us? So in this kind of ambiguous and uncertain environment, the Chinese are coming in and offering an alternative. At the moment, not with capacity and capability, but with arms sales. And I think technology. And where we in the West are always and have always held back when it comes to procuring technology to this part of the world, and the Chinese don't have any of these restrictions. They're very happy to come in when Western companies are unwilling to supply. And while 20 years ago there was a huge gap between defense industry and what they could develop in the West and what Chinese defense industry could develop, today in the time of cyber, AI, and unmanned technology, the Chinese have a competitive edge in some of the fields. They're probably even ahead of where we are.
In particular, I mean, there's something we mentioned in our paper is that in particular that's a really big supplier of unmanned drones, of unmanned ships, and there's also a lot of missiles. So, I mean, your assessment of that is that that's a real competitor to something like the UK defence industry, which is, up until now a world leader. So that's how you'd position that.
Yes, absolutely. When it comes to unmanned technology, when it comes to artificial intelligence, cyber, ballistic missiles, not really. I mean, I'm not saying that the Chinese are better than in terms of the products that the West can supply. Difference here is that Britain will not supply this kind of technology. Sure. America will not supply that kind of technology. When it comes to ballistic missiles, so the Saudis have a secret program, not so secret anymore, developing ballistic missiles against Iran, and they're doing that with Chinese aid, and somewhat under the umbrella, under the radar of their cooperation with the Americans, because simply the Americans wouldn't supply. And when the Americans supply to this part of the world, in terms even in missile defense systems, they're usually positioned in a way to protect U.S. assets, not really local assets. The Chinese are saying, you want it, you can buy it. The Qataris bought 200 missiles from the Chinese as well, ballistic missiles, amid the Gulf crisis, because they felt they're under pressure from their neighbors. So, and that is a bit of a game changer here, that there is a diversification going on in the defense industry, whereby they say we have other options now, and that is kind of fearful, which either leads to a race to the bottom whereby the standards are being lowered, and I think we've seen that post the Gulf crisis, despite the fact that the British government was very and is still very concerned about this Gulf crisis between the UAE, Saudi and Qatar. They haven't really done anything about it. Instead of using the leverage that we have in terms of arms sales, Britain said, we want the Saudis and the Emiratis to make concessions to the Qataris and get away from the position that they are. But they haven't used that leverage. Instead, they have actually sold more weapons to both sides. And I feel there is a bit of a race to the bottom here, whereby we understand that if we put more restrictions in place for arms sales and exports, then the Chinese might just come in and sell their products at our expense. And I think that is a bit of a concerning situation.
And just, looking at one of the big conflicts currently in the region, and particularly this week where we have Iran announcing more sort of violations of the nuclear deal. And this is very much pitched as a sort of US-Iran sort of battle, and you've got sort of Europe in the middle. But I think one of the interesting things about China in this is like China is a very important trading partner to Iran. It's buying huge amounts of Iranian oil and is a huge arms supplier as well to Iran. So I just wondered if you could comment on that, and also talk about what that means for some of the other countries that China has relations with in the Gulf that are very much on the other side of that conflict with Iran.
No, from the Chinese point of view, they don't differentiate. They don't care between Sunni and Shia. They don't care between Israeli, Jewish, and Arab or Muslim. They don't care about these kind of differences. But from the Arab Gulf point of view, again, the caveat I said before is, yes, they are a trading partner, they are a potential alternative, but there is no trust between the Arab Gulf countries at this point and China. They know that China, on many of the issues that the Arab Gulf states are concerned about, whether this is Libya or Syria or Iraq, Iran, they're on the other side of it. And so they're not a partner where they align in terms of their foreign and security policy. But for them, having a potentially new superpower arising that doesn't really care about what they are doing, what the Gulf is doing, is probably more beneficial than having a superpower like the Americans, who provide their support, but also always need them to be on their side. So Americans always have a bit of the our way or the highway kind of approach, and the Chinese don't have that. So the Chinese are on both sides of the current escalation when it comes to Iran, and they're probably the one country that does not comply with any of the sanctions when it comes to buying Iranian oil, and they are really helping the regime to sustain itself, if you will, through their investments. But the Chinese have a very, very strong commitment to state sovereignty. State sovereignty is an absolutely sacrosanct concept in their strategic thinking. And they do not agree, they do not think that the Iranians shouldn't have the right to develop nuclear weapons. They don't really share the same concern that the West is sharing, and definitely not the concerns that the Arab Gulf states and the Israelis are sharing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing that China is a signatory to the JCPOA nuclear agreement, but it's totally on the other side of what the US and even the European objectives seem to be. So yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Andreas, thank you so much for your time. We've covered a huge amount of ground, but thank you for joining us and being on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure.